The penthouse smelled of rain and expensive sandalwood, a sterile sanctuary 60 stories above the neon veins of Seoul. Yara Kadim didn't turn when the heavy biometric door hissed shut. She didn't have to. She felt the atmospheric pressure in the room shift the moment Kang So-jun entered. It was a weight, a sudden gravity that pulled at her pulse. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her reflection a pale ghost against the backdrop of the city's glowing arteries. She was barefoot, the silk of her slip dress whispering against her skin, a sound she knew he could hear in the oppressive silence. "You're late," she said, her voice a low, melodic challenge. So-jun didn't answer immediately. He shed his suit jacket, tossing it onto the Italian leather sofa with a practiced, lethal grace. He stopped 5 feet behind her. Always 5 feet. It was an invisible boundary, a DMZ drawn in the carpet that neither of them dared to cross. To the world, they were family by a marriage contract signed in blood and ink. To the syndicate, she was his ward, his untouchable responsibility. The council meeting ran long, he finally said. His voice was a soft rasp, the kind of sound that felt like a thumb pressed firmly against a jugular. Yara turned slowly, her sharp eyes tracing the black ink of a dragon's tail that curled from beneath his dress shirt, climbing his neck toward his jawline. It was a roadmap of the violence he moved through to get home to her. She stepped forward, closing the gap to 3 feet. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. His eyes, dark, bottomless, and starved, tracked the movement of her throat as she swallowed. "They're asking about me again, aren't they?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "The girl you keep in the clouds." "They ask because they want to find a weakness," So-jun murmured. He took a half step closer, breaking his own rule, until the heat radiating from his body reached her. He was so close she could see the slight tremor in his hands, the hands that had likely ended a life earlier that evening. "They think you're a secret I'm keeping. They don't realize you're the only thing keeping me from burning it all down." He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her cheek. He never touched. He couldn't. To touch her was to admit she was human, that he was vulnerable, that the forbidden was more than just a word. Yara leaned into the empty space where his hand lingered, her eyes defying him to close the distance. The air between them burned, thick with a hunger that was YouTube safe, but soul-shattering. "Then keep hiding me, So-jun," she whispered, a quiet fire in her eyes. "But don't pretend it's for my protection anymore." He dropped his hand, his expression returning to that terrifying, intimidating calm. "Go to sleep, Yara." He turned to leave, but the way he watched her reflection in the glass as he walked away told the truth. He wasn't her jailer, he was her devotee, and the prison wasn't the penthouse, it was the silence between them. The transition from the scented silence of the penthouse to the metallic tang of the shipyard was a shift So-jun performed with the precision of a surgeon. The humidity of the Seoul docks clung to his white dress shirt, now stripped of its tie. He stood in the center of a hollowed-out warehouse, surrounded by men twice his age who still smelled of his father's era, smoke, cheap whiskey, and outdated loyalties. At the head of the scarred wooden table sat Elder Choi, a man who had survived 3 transitions of power and clearly thought he would survive a 4th. He was leaning back, picking at a tooth, while 2 of his associates stood guard over a restrained man, bleeding onto the concrete floor. "He was skimming from the Busan shipments, So-jun," Choi said, his voice a gravelly condescension. I've already broken his hands. I thought you might want to finish it, to prove you have your father's appetite. Seo Jun didn't move. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as still as a frozen lake. The black ink on his neck seemed to darken under the harsh industrial lights. He didn't look at the man on the floor. He looked at Choi. "My father is dead," Seo Jun said, his voice barely a whisper, yet the room went unnervingly still. "And his appetite died with him. I find hunger to be a messy motivation." He walked toward the table, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash a weapon. He simply leaned down, placing his palms flat on the wood, and looked Choi directly in the eyes. The lethal patience Yara saw as a flame was, in this room, an Arctic chill. "You broke his hands because you wanted to send a message to the docks," Seo Jun continued, his tone dangerously conversational. "But you bypassed my office to do it. You wanted to see if the new king would flinch at the sight of blood." He reached out, his fingers hovering over Choi's teacup, the same way they had hovered over Yara's skin just an hour before. But here, there was no longing, only the promise of an end. "I don't flinch, Elder Choi, but I do count. And right now, you've spent more of my time than this man spent of my money." With a movement too fast for the older men to track, Seo Jun gripped the edge of the heavy table and tipped it. It crashed into Choi's lap, pinning him against his chair. In the chaos, Seo Jun didn't shout. He simply leaned over the wreckage, the dragon on his jawline appearing to flex as he spoke into Choi's ear. "Clean this up. If I see blood on my floor again without my permission, it will be yours." He turned and walked toward the exit, his black-inked silhouette cutting through the steam of the docks. His empire was a cage, and his authority was a blade. But as he stepped into his car, his mind drifted back to the one person who wasn't afraid to bleed for him. The sun didn't rise in the penthouse. It simply bled through the tinted glass, turning the minimalist white walls the color of a bruised peach. Yara watched the light crawl across the floorboards, counting the seconds until the city below began its frantic, oblivious pulse. She paced the length of the living area, her silk skirt fluttering against her ankles. She never wore shoes here. The cold friction of the hardwood against her soles was the only thing that felt real in a life lived in high-definition purgatory. To the rest of the world, Yara Kadim was a ghost story, told in the boardrooms of the syndicate, a political asset kept under glass. But to herself, she was a storm trapped in a bottle. She moved to the kitchen, her movements fluid and sharp, and poured a glass of water she didn't want, just to hear the sound of something breaking the silence. She was 27, in the prime of her life, possessed of a mind that could dissect a balance sheet as quickly as Seo Jun could dismantle an enemy. Yet her world was precisely 3,000 square feet. She walked to the secondary biometric door, the one that led to the service elevator. She pressed her palm against the scanner. A dull red light flashed. Access denied. It was a mechanical rejection she received 10 times a day, a reminder that her safety was indistinguishable from a sentence. "I am not a porcelain doll, Seo Jun," she whispered to the empty air. The frustration wasn't a roar. It was a slow, steady hum in her bones. She knew exactly how much power she held. She saw it every time Seo Jun's gaze lingered too long on the pulse point of her neck, or the way his lethal composure fractured when she stepped too close. She was the only person on Earth allowed to see the man behind the ink, yet that privilege came at the cost of her existence. She approached his private desk, running a finger over a heavy fountain pen. She wasn't submissive. She had never been. Her Afro-Arab heritage had given her a gaze that looked through people, not at them, and a defiance that burned even when she was perfectly still. She knew that if she walked out that door, the political alliance holding the underworld together would shatter. She was the linchpin. She looked at her reflection in a decorative mirror, adjusting the strap of her dress. She looked like a queen, but she felt like a weapon kept in a velvet-lined drawer. She didn't want protection. She wanted the chaos of the street, the heat of the sun, and the right to touch the man who claimed to own her. She turned as the main elevator chimed. The air shifted. The predator was home. Yara straightened her shoulders, a dangerous smile touching her lips. If she was to be his prisoner, she would make sure his cage felt smaller than hers. The tea in the porcelain cup was stone cold, but Park Min-ho, the head of the Rising Sun faction, drank it anyway. They sat in a traditional tea house on the outskirts of Incheon, a place of paper walls and sliding shadows. Seo-jun sat perfectly still, his black inked hands resting on his knees. He didn't like the way Min-ho was smiling, a jagged, yellowed expression that suggested he had found a loose thread in a tapestry. "The docks are quiet, Seo-jun," Min-ho remarked, wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief. "Too quiet. It makes a man wonder where all that legendary Kang energy is being directed. You don't gamble. You don't frequent the clubs in Gangnam. You're a monk with a crown." "I find focus more profitable than vice," Seo-jun replied, his voice a low, warning vibration. Min-ho leaned forward, the wood creaking under his weight. "Focus is good, but total isolation? That breeds rumors. My men, they've started talking about a ghost. They call her the girl in the clouds." The world didn't stop, but for Seo-jun, the oxygen in the room vanished. He didn't blink. He didn't twitch. He maintained the lethal patience that was his trademark, but beneath his ribs, a cold, violent panic began to crystallize. "I don't chase fairy tales, Min-ho. Neither should you." "Is it a fairy tale?" Min-ho's smile widened, revealing a predatory edge. "Because a delivery driver, a man who was never supposed to be on the 59th floor, saw a silhouette 3 nights ago. A woman, tall, striking, not Korean. He said she looked like a desert fire trapped in a glass jar." Seo-jun felt the ink on his skin turn to ice. The penthouse was a fortress, but no fortress was immune to the human element. A stray delivery, a momentary lapse in the digital shroud. The crack in the seal was microscopic, but in their world, a crack was as good as a shattered gate. "If I find out your men are hallucinating about my properties," Seo-jun said, rising slowly, his height casting a long, intimidating shadow over the elder boss, "I'll consider it a trespass. And you know how I handle trespassers." Of course," Min-ho chuckled, though he didn't look amused. "But be careful, Seo-jun. If she's as beautiful as they say, she isn't just a secret. She's a ransom. Or a target." Seo-jun walked out without another word, his stride steady until he reached the privacy of his black sedan. Once the door closed, he gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. His phone was already in his hand, his thumb hovering over the direct feed to the penthouse cameras. The secret was out. The wind had caught the scent of the blood, and the wolves were already lifting their heads. He had to move her. He had to hide her deeper. But as he watched the live feed of Yara standing by the window, oblivious and radiant, he realized with a jolt of terror that the world didn't just know she existed. They knew she was the only thing he couldn't afford to lose. The air in the penthouse was suffocating, charged with the static of an impending storm. Seo Jun didn't enter with his usual silent grace. He slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot against the glass walls. He moved through the foyer, shedding his coat as if it were armor that had finally grown too heavy to bear. Yara was waiting for him, bathed in the pale blue glow of the city lights. She saw the tremor in his jaw, the way the dragon ink on his neck seemed to pulse with every ragged breath. "What happened?" she asked, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "The world is getting smaller, Yara," he rasped, stopping inches from her. The 5-foot rule was gone. He stood close enough to feel the heat of her skin, his shadow swallowing her whole. "They know. Minho knows about the girl in the clouds. He knows you're here." Yara didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step toward him, her eyes searching his for the man beneath the monster. "Then let them know. Let them see me. I am tired of being your secret, Seo Jun. I am tired of living in a ghost story." "You don't understand," he hissed, his hand flying up to catch the air beside her head, pinning her against the window frame. His fingers curled into a fist, inches from her hair. "If they take you, they don't just kill you. They break you to break me. I have spent my life building walls to keep the blood off my hands. But for you, I would drown this city in it." The proximity was agonizing. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of the cold night air. Seo Jun's gaze dropped to her lips, and for the first time in years, the lethal patience snapped. His hand uncoiled, his thumb hovering just a hair's breadth from her jawline. He wanted to touch her, to verify she was real, to anchor himself to the only thing that didn't feel like a lie. Yara tilted her head, her skin practically begging for the contact. "Then touch me," she whispered, a quiet fire burning in her eyes. "Stop protecting me for 1 second and just touch me." His breath hitched. The tip of his thumb brushed the very edge of her chin, a ghost of a sensation, a forbidden spark that felt like a death sentence. It was the closest they had ever been, a microscopic surrender that felt more violent than any war he had ever fought. But as his heart hammered against his ribs, the reality of his world crashed back in. To love her was to mark her for execution. He jerked his hand back as if burned, his expression hardening into a mask of cold authority once more. "I can't," he choked out, his voice thick with a longing he refused to name. "Because if I start, I won't be able to stop. And that is exactly how they win." The silence of the penthouse didn't break, it shattered. The first indication was the muffled thwip of a high-velocity glass cutter, followed by the dull thud of a concussion grenade hitting the plush carpet. Before the white light could blind her, Yara felt a pair of powerful arms wrap around her waist, lifting her off her feet with a strength that was both terrifying and absolute. "Don't look," Seo Jun commanded, his voice a low growl against her ear, as he threw them both behind the reinforced marble kitchen island. The explosion was a roar of heat and debris. Dust choked the air, turning the luxury suite into a war zone. Shadowy figures drifted through the shattered window frames, silhouettes of men with suppressed submachine guns. They were Minho's specialists, erasing the ghost before she could be moved. Seo Jun didn't hesitate. The man who spoke softly and moved with lethal patience vanished, replaced by a force of nature. He rose from the shadows like a demon forged in ink and blood. He didn't use a gun. He was too close for that. He moved into the line of fire, his body a blur of calculated violence. Yara watched, her back pressed against the cold marble, as Seo Jun intercepted the first assassin. He caught the man's wrist, the snap of bone audible even over the ringing in her ears, and used the dying man as a shield against a spray of bullets. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He moved with a rhythmic, terrifying efficiency, disarming and dismantling the intruders with his bare hands. The pristine white floor was suddenly mapped with crimson. Seo-jun lunged for the final attacker, slamming him against the glass wall that looked out over the city. His hand gripped the man's throat, his tattoos stark and dark against his straining muscles. With a guttural snarl, he drove his palm into the man's chest, the impact sending the assassin through the weakened glass. The wind howled through the gaping hole in the penthouse, whipping Yara's hair across her face. Seo-jun stood at the edge of the abyss, his chest heaving, his white shirt ruined and soaked. He turned back to her, his eyes wild and dark. The machine, finally broken. He didn't maintain the 5-foot rule. He crossed the kitchen in 3 predatory strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. His hands, slick with the reality of his world, hovered over her shoulders. He was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline-fueled terror of almost losing her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Yara reached out, her fingers finally closing over his blood-stained wrists, anchoring him. "I'm here," she whispered. The sanctuary was gone, the glass was broken, and as Seo-jun pulled her into a desperate, crushing embrace, he knew the time for hiding was over. To keep her, he would have to become the monster the world already believed him to be. The black SUV tore through the outskirts of Seoul, a shadow cutting through the pre-dawn mist. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and copper. Seo-jun drove with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked asphalt of the highway toward Busan. Every few miles, his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, not just for headlights, but to ensure the woman in the passenger seat was still breathing. Yara sat huddled in an oversized black hoodie he had thrown at her, the heavy cotton still smelling of his sandalwood and sweat. The barefoot confidence had been replaced by a sharp, vibrating alertness. The penthouse, her gilded cage, was now a crime scene. "We can't stop," Seo-jun said, his voice a jagged rasp. "The highways are monitored, but I have a contact at the shipping yards. We disappear there." "You're bleeding," Yara said quietly. She didn't ask permission this time. She reached across the center console, her fingers gently pulling his torn sleeve back. A deep graze from a bullet furrowed his forearm, the blood matting the hair and ink of his tattoos. Seo-jun flinched, not from the pain, but from the contact. "Don't. It's a mess." "Stop it, Seo-jun." Her voice was a whip, cracking through his stoicism. She gripped his arm, forcing him to keep the wheel steady with one hand, while she pressed a clean cloth against the wound. "Stop pretending you're made of stone. You almost died back there. We almost died." The forced proximity of the cabin was a different kind of prison. There was no 5-foot rule here, no marble islands to hide behind. Just the hum of the engine and the heat of their bodies in the cramped space. Seo-jun's jaw worked, the muscle leaping under his skin. The walls he had built over years, the rules of the syndicate, the ghost of his father's expectations, were crumbling under the simple weight of her touch. "I can't lose you," he whispered, the confession falling out of him like a secret he had tried to bury in a shallow grave. "Every decision I've made since my father died has been to keep you invisible. Because as long as you were a ghost, you were safe. But I was the one who let them see you. I let my guard down because I couldn't stop looking at you." He glanced at her, and for the first time, the lethal patience was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. Yara didn't pull away. She moved her hand from his arm to his face, her thumb tracing the dark ink of the dragon on his jaw. "You didn't let them see me, Seo-jun. You let yourself see me. And if we're going to burn, let's at least do it together." The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't a barrier. It was an invitation. The safe house was a weathered cottage perched on the jagged cliffs of the Busan coastline, hidden by the roar of the sea and the salt-heavy fog. Inside, the only light came from a dying fire in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows of the dragon ink onto Seo-jun's skin. He stood by the hearth, his back to her, but the tension in his shoulders was a scream in the silence. Yara approached him, her footsteps silent on the rough floorboards. The distance that had defined their lives, the 5-foot DMZ, the biometric locks, the political lies, felt like a flimsy veil. She reached out, her hand settling between his shoulder blades. He stiffened, a low, pained sound vibrating in his chest. "Seo-jun," she breathed. "Look at me." When he turned, the intimidatingly calm mask was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, dark with a hunger that had moved past desire into something far more dangerous: obsession. He looked at her like a man drowning looks at the shore. "If I touch you," he rasped, his voice breaking, "there is no going back. The council will see it as a declaration of war. My blood for yours. Is that what you want? To be the reason I lose everything?" "You've already lost everything but me," Yara countered, her voice a quiet fire. She took the final step, closing the space until her chest brushed the ruined silk of his shirt. "Stop being a king for 1 hour. Just be the man who hid me because he couldn't bear to let anyone else look at me." The last thread of his restraint snapped. Seo-jun's hands moved with a sudden, desperate violence, cupping her face, his thumbs tracing her lips with a frantic intensity. He let out a ragged breath and finally, irrevocably, he crashed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of years of denied gravity. It tasted of salt, desperation, and the dark thrill of the forbidden. His hands slid into her hair, pulling her closer, as if he could merge her into his very skin. The "no touch" rule hadn't been to protect her. It had been to protect his own sanity. Now that it was broken, the floodgates were open. "I'm obsessed with you," he whispered against her skin, his lips tracing the line of her throat. "It's not love. It's a sickness. I see your face in every shadow of the city. I hear your voice in every order I give. You are the only world I have left." In the shadow of the cliffside, far from the rules of the syndicate and the eyes of his enemies, they finally crossed the line. They were no longer protector and ward, no longer family by law. They were two fugitives committing the greatest sin in their world, choosing each other over the crown. The temple was silent, tucked away in the shadows of the Bukhansan peaks, far from the neon pulse of the city. Here, the Council of Elders sat in a semicircle, their faces carved from the same cold stone as the mountain. They were the architects of the bloodlines, the keepers of the law that Seo-jun had just set on fire. Seo-jun stood in the center of the hall, the ink on his neck visible as he held his head high. He hadn't washed the salt of the Busan Sea from his skin, nor had he tucked away the memory of Yara's touch. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth dying for. "You were given a throne, not a playground," Elder Choi's voice echoed, devoid of its usual condescension. Now, it was only judgment. "We tolerated the girl because she was a ghost, a political placeholder. But a ghost does not leave her prints on the king's skin." He tossed a grain-heavy photograph onto the floor. It was a shot from the Busan highway. Seo Jun's hand on Yara's neck, a moment of undeniable, frantic intimacy. "The syndicate is built on the purity of the alliance," another elder remarked, his voice like dry parchment. "By touching her, you have turned a strategic union into a scandal. You have made yourself a laughingstock to the rising sun and a liability to us. The law is absolute, Seo Jun. You know the price of this particular treason." Seo Jun didn't blink. The law was written by men who were too afraid to admit that power is empty without a reason to hold it. Choi stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You speak of reasons? Then here is your reality. You have 24 hours to restore the balance. You will bring her to the docks. You will end the distraction yourself, in front of the council, to prove your loyalty to the bloodline." A heavy silence followed, thick with the scent of incense and impending death. "And if I refuse?" Seo Jun asked, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Then you are no longer a king. You are a target," Choi replied. "We will strip you of your name, your assets, and your protection. We will hunt you both to the ends of the earth. You can be a dead man with a soul, or a living god with a crown. Choose." Seo Jun looked at the photograph on the floor. He saw the way he was looking at Yara, not as a boss, but as a man who had finally found his gravity. He thought of the penthouse, the silence, and the way her quiet fire had finally warmed his frozen world.
"I've already made my choice," Seo Jun said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he turned his back on the council. "And by the time you realize what it is, I'll have already burned the throne you're so desperate to save." The end did not come with a whimper, but with the synchronized roar of a city coming undone. Seo Jun sat in his father's old office, his fingers dancing over a keyboard with the same lethal precision he used to break bones. He wasn't just deleting files, he was severing the nervous system of an empire. With a final keystroke, the offshore accounts that fueled the council's greed vanished into the digital ether, and the encrypted evidence of 30 years of syndicate atrocities was sent directly to every major news outlet in Seoul. The power went out across the district. Below, the sirens began their long, mournful wail. Seo Jun stepped out onto the helipad of the central tower, where the wind whipped his white shirt against his frame. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man who had set his own house on fire just to see the sun. Yara was already there, leaning against the skids of a nondescript black chopper. She wore a leather jacket and heavy boots, her quiet fire now a blazing hearth. She didn't look afraid of the chaos below. She looked like she had been waiting for the world to catch up to her. "It's done," Seo Jun said, the sound of his voice nearly lost to the roar of the approaching rotors. "The council is currently being raided. The rising sun is fighting for scraps. There is no empire left to inherit." Yara walked toward him, her eyes fixed on the man who had traded a crown for a life. She reached out, her fingers sliding into his, interlacing with the black ink of his knuckles. This time, there was no hesitation, no 5-foot rule, no forbidden gravity. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice steady. "To a place where ghosts don't have to hide," he replied. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers as the helicopter began its ascent. The lethal patience had finally found its purpose, not in waiting for power, but in waiting for her. As the chopper rose, the lights of Seoul flickered and died beneath them. The city looked like a scattering of cold embers. The Korean Mafia boss had hidden her from the world because loving her was forbidden. But in the end, he had realized the world wasn't worth keeping if she wasn't by his side. They didn't look back at the burning ruins of the Kang legacy. They looked at each other, the only two people left in a world that finally belonged to them.